Hello and welcome to a new program, Science Solutions. This program is something that we felt was needed because one of the major issues that all life forms face on the planet is adaptability. We're always looking at how can we change given conditions that are changing, and how can we succeed as life forms, and how can we make life better for human beings. So science enters into this because science looks at things in terms of how do things work. Science starts without passing judgments first. Science begins by just looking at things and saying, well, what's going on? What's happening? Can we understand it? Can we measure it? And then we try to figure out, is there anything we need to do about it? So we're very fortunate today on this first program to be welcoming Nathan S. Lewis, who is a professor at the California Institute of Technology. Nate, welcome to Science Solutions.
Thanks.
Great to have you here. And I'll give a little background on Professor Lewis, on what he's up to. He heads up a new project involving artificial photosynthesis, and we'll get into that. But his work is featured in the October issue of Scientific American magazine. And in this magazine, it describes Professor Lewis as saying humankind needs a radical breakthrough in solar fuel technology. This is because, according to Professor Lewis's calculations, civilization must be able to generate more than 10 trillion watts of clean, carbon-free energy by 2050. This level is 3 times the United States average energy demand of 3.2 trillion watts. And so, therefore, Professor Lewis is saying that he's heading up a project to make what in effect is artificial plant leaves that will generate fuel by a system of photosynthesis using sunlight. And this fuel will then be used for energy purposes, which can be consumed in various ways, either burning it or using it chemically in other ways to make it provide energy for us. And we're going to have Professor Lewis talk about this. In July of 2010, Nate Lewis received an award from the Department of Energy of $122 million over 5 years to head up a team of scientists at several laboratories to develop solar fuel technology. Solar fuels might thus solve the 2 big problems, energy security and carbon emissions. Well, Nate, maybe you could describe what does that mean? What are those problems, those 2 problems?
If you think about energy, I think it's meant to confuse people. There are BTUs, there are kilowatt hours of electricity, there's cubic feet of natural gas, there's quadrillion British thermal units in a year. Nobody has a clue what any of this means. So I want to explain it to the person on the street. Everybody understands watts. You know, a 100-watt light bulb. You know how many watts your toaster or your TV consumes. So let's only think in watts. If you measured the average energy meter of our planet, right now it would read 15 trillion watts. It means we can't solve the energy problem unless we provide people with something like 10, 15, or 20 trillion watts. Now that's today, but there are lots of people, 2 billion people that live for under $2 a day. They want to be like us. Even if we save more energy than you and I consume combined, when they start to get not diseased, to get out of dire poverty, to get educated, they'll consume energy too. Even if we save as much energy as all the energy we consume today, almost all projections show that due to population growth and economic growth, energy demand's going to double within our lifetime. So it's going to be something like 20, 30 trillion watts. Even if we saved energy to a level to keep energy demand constant, something that's never been done in human history, we still have to make 15 trillion watts. So that's the challenge.
So the constant demand would be 15 trillion watts no matter what, even if we didn't increase anything.
Right. Okay, so that's the scale of the problem, 15 trillion watts. Now, right now, 85% of that comes from our old friends, fossil energy, oil, coal, and gas. And we have a lot of it. And we might peak with oil sometime, but we've got hundreds of years worth of coal and lots, tremendous reserves of natural gas. We can convert that into oil. Germany did that in World War II. When the Allies denied them oil, they made their own. South Africa does that today from apartheid boycotts. They make their own coal into liquid fuels.
So if we have all this oil and coal, why is there a problem?
Well, there's national security problems. Sometimes we buy oil from countries that aren't our friends. And, you know, it's been said that it's pretty hard to win a war when you're funding both sides. Right? There's another problem. The other war is the environmental war. Carbon emissions, if we continue on our trend, would go up like that. And, of course, there is debate as to what a level of CO2 in our atmosphere would be, quote, safe, end quote. We actually don't know the answer to that because this is a world that no human will have ever otherwise lived in. There are at least 6 major climate models and they differ from each other. You know what that means? At least 5 of them must be wrong.
Now, what are the risks of a carbon trend like this?
Oh, well, the last time this happened, 230 million years ago, the temperatures rose 6 degrees centigrade, 12 at the poles. The fossil record showed that 90% of the species then on Earth couldn't adapt and went extinct. We don't know for sure what would happen again, but we do know it lasts for thousands of years. 3,000 years is a good number. So we are just, every time you step on the gas, every time you flip a light switch, every time you go out of your house and turn on some energy source, we are just contributing to do the biggest experiment with the Earth that humans will have ever done.
Now, Nate, there's a lot of debate, of course, about, for example, the global warming issue, and I don't want to get into that too much detail, but people will say, well, it may not be man-made, maybe it's natural. Does it really matter if it's human-caused or natural? Do we face the same problem regardless?
Okay. So there's 2 different points here. One, are humans emitting carbon dioxide to the air? And the answer to that is unambiguously yes. We have scientific proof that the carbon from fossil energy is a different form, it's a different age than the carbon dioxide in the oceans.
Oh, so you can actually isolate the human-caused carbon dioxide then?
Of course. But on top of that, you don't need to be a scientist to know that when you fill up your gas tank and then it's empty, that the stuff that you burnt went into the air. Where else did it go? It's not in your oil pan below your car. So it's pretty obvious that humans emit from fossil fuel consumption a lot of CO2 to the air. Now, we do know that humans are taking from their actions CO2 levels to higher than any one of us would otherwise have experienced. We don't absolutely know whether that will cause the temperatures of the air to rise or not. We do know that when you add CO2 to water, you make it acidic. Anybody that's ever had soda knows that. And we know the acidity of the oceans is now higher than at any time in the past 4 million years. Most models say that 90% of the coral on our planet will be bleached within our lifetimes because of ocean acidification.
Does that mean killed?
It means that the coral might survive, but the ecosystems that thrive on the coral, that give it the colors, that are at the bottom of the food chain in the oceans themselves, will be very different, if existent at all, in their forms as you and I know them now.
So are you going to show us a little more of the problem and then some of your approaches to deal with this problem? I'm eager to see what your next display is. And,
well, if you agree that for either energy security or environmental security, or better, both, that we have a big problem with respect to energy, then let's look at some numbers that tell us where the solutions are. Because we hear a lot about it from politicians. But, you know, there are real numbers involved here. If we need 15 trillion watts of carbon-free power, because if you need to cut those emissions of carbon or save as much oil as all the oil and gas and coal we now use, then you could do that if you wanted to bury it all underground, so-called clean coal. You would have to bury an amount of CO2 equivalent to the volume of Lake Superior every single year somewhere under our soils.
Lake Superior.
And it can't leak.
And how big is Lake Superior approximately?
It turns out Lake Superior has 12,500 cubic kilometers of volume. So it's an enormous amount of CO2 that would have to be buried that can't leak for 100 years. 1% of it leaks. Now, we just had a little leak somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's going to be pretty hard to convince people that, trust me, I'm going to put a whole lot of stuff under your ground, and it's not going to leak for another 100 or 200 years, no problem.
Okay.
Well, if you don't do that, you could do it with nuclear power, which is actually the only proven low-carbon technology that could scale to these levels. Now, I'm not against nuclear power. In fact, if you don't play that card, it's really hard to see how you can make ends meet. But if you need to get 15 trillion watts, a nuclear power plant makes 1 billion watts. That means you need 15,000 nuclear power plants. You may have remembered in the presidential campaign that one side said, I'm going to build 46 new nuclear power plants. That was the energy policy of the United States. Well, 46 is nothing if you need 15,000. I mean, you need to build a nuclear power plant every single day somewhere in the world for the next 40 straight years.
Oh my.
If you only build one a week, you leave 90% of this problem on the table. That's the scale of energy.
Now, France apparently is way ahead on this. 80% of their power, I'm told, is already nuclear power.
So that's of their electricity, not of their total energy. So 80% of their electricity is nuclear power, which is about 10% of the total energy consumed in the United States or in somewhere like France. Because after all, we don't use electricity to heat our homes, to drive our cars around. And if you did that, you need even more electricity.
So they don't have that solved either.
They don't have it solved either. Well, you could get it from renewables. But in fact, there's only one big card. If you look at all the arithmetic of how much geothermal energy and how much biomass and how much wind there is, in the end, if you need 10 trillion watts, the answer is actually nuclear power. It's nuclear power. Nuclear fusion is the answer. But you know, it's really good to be not too close to a nuclear reactor. And 93 million miles sounds just about right.
The distance to the sun.
The big nuclear reactor in the solar system that provides all the energy humans could ever dream of is the sun. We need 10 trillion or 15 trillion watts. The sun gives us 120,000 trillion watts.
Oh my. Have we got a word for that? 1,000 trillion? What is 1,000 trillion? Quadrillion?
All you need to remember is that in the course of this program, in the 1 hour, more energy in this 1 hour is going to hit the Earth than all the energy consumed on our planet in an entire year. Nothing else comes even close.
Amazing.
So it's clear. You have a big card waiting in the deck. You have maybe clean coal. Maybe you're going to build a nuclear power plant every couple days. And then you've got the ace in the hole, or maybe the joker, depending on how well we as scientists give us the ability with technology to exploit this enormous resource, and that's the sun. So now if you agree there are 3 possible big solutions, let's go see what we can do as scientists to let society play that really, really, really big card, the sun. Well, we know there are 3 ways to deal with that. You can be like a plant, and plants make fuel from sunlight. That's the good news. We can store that fuel. We can go get it when we want it. Problem is, they make a fuel nobody can use, lignocellulose. And you and I want gasoline, or we want to burn this stuff.
Now, lignocellulose sounds like a sugar.
It's the stuff that's on the cell walls of plant that you have to convert actually into sugars and then ferment that to get something like ethanol out of corn or out of switchgrass. But the lignocellulose is the stuff that you and I throw away when you recycle your green waste. That's biomass.
And it doesn't sound very efficient then.
And in fact, if you take the fastest growing plant and you average it over a year, and you take all the energy in the fastest growing plant on a farm, and you divide that by the total amount of sunlight that same square acre would get, less than 1% of the sunlight is stored in all the energy in the fastest growing plant. So nature gets an A for the idea. Nature gets an F for the engineering. Okay? So good idea, use the biggest resource. Bad idea, only use 1% of it. But that means that we have another option. We could make solar cells. They use 20% of it. You can buy the panels, put them on the roof. The problem is that A, they're too expensive, but the big problem is they don't store that energy. And last time I looked, the sun has this nasty little habit. Seems like it gets dark around here every single night. And so unless you find a way to store, he that cannot store shall not have power after 4. Right?
Well, that's a nice poem.
Nice little poem. I think if Johnny Cochran Jr. were an energy engineer, that would be the thing he wants you to remember, right? So we got to find a way to store sunlight to compensate for its intermittency. There's no good way to store electricity. That's why you can't sell solar electricity at nighttime when we really need it to light our lights, because there's no way to store it from the day to the night. We could pump water uphill, but if you want to store the amount of energy in 1 gallon of gasoline, you have to pump 55,000 gallons of water up the height of Hoover Dam.
How about charging batteries?
Charging batteries. The energy in the best battery is 200 watt-hours in a kilogram. The energy in gasoline is 13,000 watt-hours in the same kilogram. That's why it's hard to go very far on an electric car, because nothing comes close to the energy stored in chemical bonds. Nature figured that out. That's what's stored in oil, gas, coal, and plants. That's what we have to do. We have to figure out a way to take our biggest energy source, the sun, and to store it in the most dense form that we can know on our planet, other than in the nucleus. We got to make chemical fuel directly from sunlight. Now this sounds like magic. How in the world would we do that? But it's not magic. I mean, the Wright brothers figured out that once it was possible to fly, that birds did it. They figured out a way to do it, but we don't build airplanes out of feathers, right? Same thing. Let's go do what a plant does. But let's not make it green, let's make it black. Let's not make it inefficient, let's make it like solar cells, let's make it efficient. Let's not make a plant die every year, let's make the stuff last for 30 years, so you have to put it up there once. And let's make something that we can all use whenever we want. Let's make a fuel that we can drop into our existing energy infrastructure instead of talking about how to switch loads and do all this other stuff. Okay, so the challenge for scientists is to be the Wright brothers, to get off the ground and to find a way, now that nature tells us it's possible, to do it ourselves, but do it better.
And what kind of fuel are we talking about?
Well,
this synthetic fuel.
So we really want ultimately to make a liquid fuel. We want to power our airplanes. And last time I looked, nobody's figured out a way to make a hydrogen or a plug-in hybrid airplane with a big long cord. You got to make a liquid fuel. Okay. But that doesn't really constrain scientists, because if we can make, for instance, hydrogen from water, we already know in refineries how to react hydrogen with CO2 in the air and make liquid fuel. We can take hydrogen and upgrade biofuels and triple energy content. There's lots of things we can do with one fuel to make it into another. So we're going to start by taking water and sunlight and a membrane, just like the plant's membrane, and absorbing that light and then directing the electrons to make hydrogen and directing the electron vacancies to make oxygen. You probably remember doing this in high school chemistry when you had a battery and you turned up the battery and then you made hydrogen and oxygen from water.
You're splitting it off,
You're
really.
splitting it off to make the fuel from the battery. But we don't want a battery. We want to use the sun to do the virtual battery in the same way that plants use the sun as their power source. Just we want to build this out of pieces that don't have feathers on them or don't have leaves, because we can do it better. Now, how can I say that? Well, we need to take a lesson from a plant. A plant doesn't have one light absorber. It has two. They're two photosystems. They're both chlorophylls. They're two photosystems. And that's what we're going to do.
And they react to different colors? Is that the idea, that these two types of chlorophyll actually absorb or work with different colors?
They actually don't absorb too much different. They're both green. That's a design flaw. It would be better. It would be better if one was absorbing the red and the other was absorbing the blue. That's what we're going to do.
Oh.
Because we want to be smarter, and that's better.
Well, the government is betting on you so far. The Department of Energy is staking $122 million that your dream is realizable. So how do you plan to do that? Right.
How did we get that? There's a mineral. This mineral is called strontium titanate. If you actually shine light on this mineral, it will, as you can see here, store energy from the sun directly as chemical fuel by splitting it from water into hydrogen and oxygen. This works. We already know that we can split water into fuel from sun at a higher efficiency than the fastest known growing plant.
Is that called a catalyst?
This is called a photocatalyst because it takes the photons of sunlight and directly makes fuel. So we know it can be done. Now the menu has three options. We want it to all be really efficient so we don't have to cover lots of land. We want it to be really cheap so we don't have to spend lots of money. And we want it to last for a long time so we don't have to keep putting them up every 6 months. And right now, I can give you 2 out of 3. If you want it to be cheap and efficient, I can give that to you, but it doesn't last. If you want it to be cheap and last, I can give that to you too, but it's not efficient. If you want it to be efficient and last, I can give that to you, but it's not cheap. We know we can do 2 out of 3. Our challenge is to go for the trifecta.
So right now you can do 2 out of 3.
We can do 2 out of 3.
And are you looking at any kind of time frame generally that you think you might be able to accomplish?
We're going to have something that's going to work, that you're going to hold in your hand in a couple years, and it's going to take sunlight and make fuel.
That fast? 2 years. You'll have a concept.
We're going to have a concept prototype. Now we know, just like any company, that our first product is going to fail. Right? But we know if you don't fail, you'll never succeed. So we know this first product we're going to build is going to be something we're going to hold in our hands. It's going to get the flows and the light, and you'll be able to tilt it, and we'll be able to work out a lot of stuff. And then I'm going to be able to tell you next year we made it 30% better or 40% cheaper because of the new pieces we put in here, because of the new ways we found to build the catalyst, because of the new catalyst we discovered. Then we'll have Gen 2. And then the next year, we're going to have Gen 3.
So you've talked about these Gen levels. So by the time you get to Gen 5, over 5 years?
So we think at Gen 5, the idea is that we're going to have a prototype that is going to be something that could be manufactured at scale. We have industrial advisors from oil companies, from materials companies, from chemical companies, from venture capitalists. And the idea of this Joint Center for Artificial Photosynthesis, the award for the initials JCAP, is that there are two buildings. This one's a picture of the building that will be renovated, artist rendition on the Caltech campus. And there'll be 100 scientists and engineers working on that. And the other building will look a little different with a view of the Golden Gate Bridge from the hills of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory with another 100 scientists. And they'll be linked by video in every corner of every room so that they think they're working in the same building all the time. And we will have people from all walks of science, engineers, chemists, material scientists. When they walk into those doors, the only thing they're thinking about is how to build this artificial photosynthetic system 24 hours a day, 7 days a week until we're done.
So you're going to try to produce hydrogen and perhaps methanol, methane, things like that, maybe ethanol, those kinds of things that can be used as fuels to either burn or to chemically react such that they would create energy.
Exactly. And the reason we're starting with hydrogen is chemically that to make hydrogen from water, you only need to make one chemical bond. You need to combine two hydrogen atoms to make an H2 hydrogen gas molecule. If you want to reduce carbon dioxide, like a plant does in real photosynthesis, you have to feed in 6 electrons to make methanol and 8 to make methane.
Now, methanol is wood alcohol.
Methanol is wood alcohol, and you can make really good fuel from methanol as a liquid if we had that as a product.
Now, if you do this, Nate, do you actually get less of a carbon emission into the atmosphere than what we do now with our conventional approaches with the petrochemical fuels that we already have?
Well, ultimately, you would have 0 net emissions. Think about the two scenarios. If you only feed in water, and then out comes hydrogen, when you burn the hydrogen, you get water again. If you take the hydrogen and feed in carbon dioxide, and then make something like methanol, when you burn it, you get back the water and carbon dioxide. So again, you close the loop without consuming or making any net carbon.
So you have, I guess, what you call a 0 net carbon emission? Is that what you call it?
The only difference is that, of course, all the carbon and fossil fuels that we now emit came from the sun and photosynthesis. It took 100 million years or more to deposit it, and we're now burning it within 100 years.
We're mining it from the ground. And
faster than a rate at which we're replenishing it. But if you can replenish it at the same rate that you mine it, then you don't add or subtract any carbon from the air.
So we actually would be able to lower this carbon emission and keep it stable, I guess, is what you would say.
You would keep the concentration of CO2 stable, and you would take the emissions by this process down to essentially 0.
Now, you have said that something to the effect here of we are not yet treating this problem like one where we can't afford to fail. Why is that? What's going on? Is it a problem that we can't afford to fail with?
We need another energy miracle in order to find energy that's just as cheap as the energy we now have, but that both is safe and is secure for every country that wants it. So if you want to succeed, we know what the guideline is. And the guideline is, if you're a pharmaceutical company or that industry, you take 10% of your revenue and invest that again into R&D in order to generate the next generation of antibiotics so the bugs don't mutate faster than your product does, or cure the next disease, or help people with the human condition. If you're a semiconductor industry and you want to build the next generation of computer chips, you take 10% of revenue into R&D to build the next microprocessor, to build the next iPhone, to build the next computer display. the energy industry spends 0.1% of revenue on R&D.
Well, now you're introducing a subject that I'm fond of looking at, the definition of serious. It sounds from what you're describing, and I think from what anybody can observe, that are we really serious about alternative energy? Now, I define serious in this context in a certain way. I define serious as willing and able to devote the necessary resources to get the desired result.
Right.
You can say, I'm very serious. Okay, are you going to pony up the money and the work power in order to get this done? Are you going to put up the necessary kinds of resources and information you're going to have to draw on? To me, that's serious. It actually costs to be serious in the way I look at it. So, are we serious?
Well,
there's 122 million from DOE says they're serious.
Well, as a percentage of revenue, the amount of money spent on R&D by the electric utility company industry in our country as a percentage of their revenue is less than that of the dog food industry.
You mean there's more R&D in the dog food industry per amount of output than there is in the electric utility industry?
Absolutely. So by that measure, we're serious about the next generation of high-tech dog food. But we're going to the dogs if you think we're serious about getting clean energy technology online. So when would we be serious? When we stop thinking about a dangerous dependence on foreign oil and start worrying about a dangerous dependence on foreign solar cells.
Okay, now
then we're serious.
This sounds great, Nate. Now, the typical question that I will ask you from a business standpoint is how much is this going to cost compared with what I'm paying now?
Well, I don't think that's the right question to ask because it's going to cost up front to do R&D, like it always costs to do R&D to get the next generation of better, faster, cheaper products. But I think that the problem has always been that we view clean energy as always more expensive than dirty energy, and therefore it's going to cost you money. But in fact, there's no law of physics that says I can't make solar cells that you can paint on your roof that would be cheaper than coal. And you can argue that this whole debate of taxing energy and of Copenhagen failure was because there was this perception and current reality that clean energy is going to cost you money. On the other hand, if we do R&D and find a way to make clean energy the cheapest energy, you're not going to need the IPCC or these countries meeting. It's going to happen because everybody's going to want to do it. It's going to be the next big thing, and we're going to save money, and that's why you really want to do the R&D. So you have your cake and eat it too. So it's the cheapest way to make energy.
All right, now let's say that I'm an ultra-nationalist, and I want to make sure that America is in the lead on all this. How do we rank compared to other countries? Maybe they're also looking at artificial photosynthesis or other approaches. How do we stack up, Nate, vis-a-vis the other countries?
So that's a great question. I think that there are a few important areas of science and technology, more than a few, but certainly a few where the United States is still intellectually in the lead. And there's little question in my mind that in artificial photosynthesis and in solar fuels, we are definitely in the lead right now. Had we not put an effort like JCAP on the table, then very shortly we wouldn't have maintained that leadership position because our ideas, our students, our intellectual property flow would have all gone offshore. We would have farmed out the brains, not just the jobs. So we need to do this. We need to do this to stay in the lead and find a way then to capture the manufacturing, because I just don't want the patents here and the jobs there. I want to have it all.
That was my next question. Given that you succeed here, and I think Washington and the community is betting that you will, the big thing is to then become the world's leading manufacturer of these devices. America has given up jobs, has given up industry. We've seen the steel industry migrate. We've seen even American flags now are made in Asia. And so we've kind of gotten discouraged. We've said, gee, it looks like we just aren't going to lead in manufacturing of anything anymore. Cars are now happening overseas more, and they're reliable and everything. But it sounds like this is an opportunity for us to lead the world in manufacturing something that everybody needs.
Exactly. So my personal opinion, but it's only an opinion because I'm not an expert in this area, is the best defense is a great offense here. Keep plowing in technology that's the next generation of faster, better, cheaper, so that you can't be obsoleted by a commodity that somebody snarfs up and stamps out 1 million of somewhere else, because by the time they have the 1 million, you have the next product already that's faster, better, cheaper than the one that they're making, and let them go follow you because you're going to win every time.
Very good. I like that.
Right. Now I want to tell you how we're going to do this. What are these people doing in this building? Well, as I said, we're going to try to build this product, but most people don't really know what an artificial photosynthesis product is going to look like. Now that's pretty fair, because the Wright brothers didn't know what a 747 would look like. So we have to have a little vision of further out. Not if, when we build this thing, when we build it, we have to think ahead into what it's going to look like. And what we really want it to look like is basically like bubble wrap. We basically want it to be something that in goes water from a sprinkler, just like you water your lawn, and then the sun hits it, and then out comes either a gas that you collect in a tank somewhere, or a liquid that you skim off the top or the bottom, and then you put it in your car, or you burn it in your water heater in your home, and you're done. Now, some people say, why don't I just have wires with solar cells, and I'm going to make my fuel somewhere in some big building? It's because wires cost a lot of money, actually. You know, when you go to the gas pump and you fill up your car through a $5 piece of plastic pipe, you're actually filling it up at a rate of power of 10 megawatts. You can't build a 10 megawatt transmission line for a $5 piece of plastic pipe. No less, it's $1 million a mile to build a transmission line in our country today. So it turns out that electricity isn't a very good way to move large amounts of energy, but chemical fuels are a great way to move it. That's why it only takes you 3 minutes to recharge your car and 30 hours or some longer time to charge your batteries. All right? So we want no wires, we want no bugs. That's our motto. No bugs, no wires. I want you to be able to go buy this stuff at Home Depot, so that the manufacturing is you and me going to the store and going green, because green is good for everybody. Green means money here, not just green means environmental consciousness.
Can I buy this at an ExxonMobil station somewhere?
You might be able to. Mm-hmm. And the oil companies and chemical companies are very interested in this, because after all, they make their industrial living on selling chemical fuels. This is just another way to make chemical fuels. And for all you and I know, we wouldn't care if that pump gas station oil came from solar fuels instead of from dinosaur fuels. What difference would it make?
Now, can you meet this huge demand of 10 trillion watts by 2050? Do you project you can do that with your approach?
Well, we know it can scale. So we know that the approach, the idea of having something like bubble wrap that you'd roll it on your roof, we'd have to cover a lot of roofs, but there's a lot of people, and if everybody only has to do it once, that it could be scaled. Now, it would be a huge industry. That's both the challenge and the opportunity. If you want to stand up something the equivalent of ExxonMobil plus Shell plus all the oil and gas companies, that's a lot of product. The good news is that's a lot of product to be made in the United States, to be consumed by us. So it's not only possible, every challenge is an opportunity. And if you're short enough, you can only see the part of the glass that's filled, no matter how much of it's
How much
empty.
potential you have above
Exactly.
it. Right.
So that's fine. So why do we think we can do this? Well, there's a good idea here. The good idea is if you build a solar cell, right now it costs a lot of money. The reason it costs a lot of money is you need a certain thickness of light to absorb the sun of this silicon. It has to be a certain thickness. 200 microns is how thick the silicon has to be in the 90% of solar panels that are made out of silicon. Well, that's all fine. Just make 200 micron silicon wafers.
How thick is that?
It's about 10 times a human hair, 20 times a human hair.
Okay.
2/10 of a millimeter. But it's brittle, and it has to be incredibly pure. Because if the light comes in to that silicon wafer, that thick slab, and if it tried to come back out, it has to make electricity just by getting all that excitation energy right back to the top to get to the wire. Otherwise, it just makes heat. But that means that silicon has to be incredibly pure. It's the purest stuff you and I are ever going to touch.
And that's very expensive to
And
make.
that's very expensive to make. So how are we going to get around that? The idea is we're going to make something very long that still can absorb the light, but if it's very narrow, then the excitation only has to go a short distance sideways. And then it can be really cheap because we don't have to move those electrons all the way back up. They only have to go sideways, just like hairs on a hairbrush. And then we want two of them. We want one to do what you said at the beginning, to absorb the blue and let through the red, and then the other one grabs the red. This is why we think we're better than a plant, because we're not using two chlorophylls. We have one material that's blue and the other one that gets all the energy from the red. And then the other neat trick is that we don't want any wires here. We don't make electricity, we make fuel. And that is perfect to conform to all the nooks and crannies of this structure. And then the carriers can go sideways into catalysts that can make fuel directly. Now we don't want the oxygen. We let that go into the air, so that's on the top. And then the plastic is the membrane that keeps the hydrogen that we want down below out to a pipe.
So are we oxygenating the atmosphere with this process as well?
All the oxygen in the atmosphere came from photosynthesis. So we would be adding a little bit of oxygen to the air, but then when you burn the hydrogen, you're consuming the same oxygen. So at net,
It's back to neutral.
it's back to neutral. Okay. You know, it turns out this is a good idea because nature had it first. It's exactly what an aspen tree forest does. Lots of long trees to absorb the sunlight, and then narrow branches to move the nutrients sideways a short distance. That's what roots do. That's what leaves do. That's what stomata do. So it sounds like something figured this out a while ago, and it's a good idea for you and me to try to do it again on the nano scale in this solar device.
All right, now I want to mention something here. John Doerr funded a company up in the Bay Area, San Francisco area, named Bloom Energy, and the report is that he is the venture capitalist who was able to fund Google and Amazon.com. He funded this company, Bloom Energy. It is reported about $400 million. You got, and that's for fuel cell technology. That's sort of like a battery, except you run in a fuel like alcohol or hydrogen and you get out electricity, and it just keeps happening as long as you run in the fuel. It's the same as a battery, except you keep running fuel through it. So John Doerr raised about $400 million. You've got a measly 122. It sounds to me that you could really capitalize on some really serious funding here beyond this 122. I mean, the 122 to me sounds almost like seed money. Right. If we fund a private company, let alone a huge research team of Caltech and Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, you've got a global thing you're talking about here, and you're getting, you know, a little more than a quarter of what these fellows got for just a private company. It seems to me that this process, the JCAP hub program, you call it, qualifies for a lot more money, even though 122 is nothing to ignore. But it sounds to me, coming from the business world again, that you should be getting a lot more money from whatever sources.
So there's two ways to look at this. One is you had the right word, the seed money. JCAP is the seed part of what we hope is going to be a transformative energy industry. To seed that industry is our job, and to manufacture and develop the actual products is not. Bloom had to do the latter, but they didn't actually, although no one knows for sure, probably invent very much up front in the former, in the seed stage, because I think that that's mostly a high temperature solid oxide fuel cell, of which there were known implementations previously, and although we don't know for sure what Bloom has, it's probable that they have a variant on the existing technology that the $400 million has gone into trying to commercialize and market.
So how high is high temperature of that fuel cell?
Well, the existing ones that I know about run at 800 degrees centigrade.
So that takes a lot of energy.
It takes a lot of heat to run them, but
Right.
it's really that they're not particularly economical because you have to prevent the products from making what's called coke, which is just charcoal essentially over all of the surfaces. You have to supply very clean natural gas or hydrogen to it. And there are other ways of burning those products at the same temperatures, like in turbines with steam engines at the bottom called bottoming cycles, that are pretty cost effective.
Okay, so now fuel cells have been around for, gosh, 100 years or something like that. Your process is actually revolutionary.
Right.
This is not doing what is happening in Germany or in other areas of Europe or Asia. This is really a radical leap that you're talking about here.
Exactly.
So given that, it sounds like the requirement to fund this is greater, but the rewards can be tremendously greater.
Sure. You know, so if you think about the arguments that we have, we as the public, valid of, well, we can't scale solar panels right now because they're like museum pieces of artwork of glass that have to be installed, and then we don't have any solution for the intermittency. And we can't do biofuels because if we did it at scale, we'd trade food for fuel, and there's energy problems with how much you make compared to how much you have to put in. And there's nuclear waste problems. Everything has problems. And then if you step back and say, if I could wave the magic wand and develop a technology that could mitigate all the problems at once, what would you do? You would take the biggest energy source we have and you would convert it directly into stored chemical fuel. That's what artificial photosynthesis is.
Well, Nate, that sounds exactly like an encapsulated wrap-up of what you've presented here. I think it's a good place to pause and let our viewers now watch this program, I hope repeatedly. I know I'm going to watch it repeatedly to try to absorb all of these things that you've presented. Do you have any other points you want to highlight before we wrap up here in the next few minutes?
Yeah. Well, I think the only important thing is to realize that science and technology, when it comes to energy, can give us better choices. We are not confined to say you have to tax energy in order to do this or that, or we can't drive electric cars, because the world is not going to stand still. And if we let our scientists and engineers turn loose on this problem, find ways to build 3 times better batteries than the ones we have now, then we'll have range in electric cars. Find lighter weight materials that are safe to build cars out of. They'll go further. If we let our scientists figure out ways to do things like artificial photosynthesis, to do things like find ways to store massive quantities of energy, then we are going to completely change the equation and change the world in which we live. So I see this as not only the challenge, but as absolutely the right thing to do. This should be America's moonshot right here and right now.
Nate, that sounds great. And it's, again, about human adaptability. We have all these challenges and opportunities, and we adapt. We adapt by trying new things. They don't always work, but we know we're not going to get anywhere if we don't try. And that's really the story of human success ever since the initiation of the species. So I'm very excited about what you're doing. I have no problem thinking you're going to succeed. I want to be an investor in one of these spin-off companies that you create. And I really want to thank you for being our first guest on Science Solutions. I think it's a terrific thing you've shown us here. Thank you very much,
Thanks
sir.
very much. Appreciate it.